Hi, welcome back to TechCrunch
Thanks for
Disrupt.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming too.
So let's just start right in with you seem to be everywhere. You had a piece of like every big last generation company, in my opinion, Airbnb, Airtable, Anduril, Brex, Coinbase, Figma, Notion, Stripe, OpenDoor, Rippling, and Deal. And now you are early into AI, right? So Perplexity, Character.AI, Mistral, Harvey. You even had a piece of that new $300 million seed deal for Periodic Labs. So are you in any other model makers? Are you in OpenAI or Anthropic? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a small investor from a while ago in OpenAI, but other than that, haven't done much on the model side recently, except for Periodic, which you mentioned.
So, with all of that, you actually hold kind of an intriguing view. You believe that there are some AI markets that are pretty much already settled who the winners are going to be, and some that aren't. So let's start with the ones that you think are pretty much settled. And caveat, he did warn me, he may not be 100% correct, but let's hear.
Oh, I'm often very slightly correct or not at all. So I think all this is with a lot of caveats. Fundamentally, if I go back a year or two, so basically I started investing in generative AI in 2021 or so. And I think at the time, not very many people were paying that much attention to it. GPT-2 had come out and then 3. And the step between 2 and 3 was so large that if you just extrapolated out the scaling laws or the curve, then you could really assume that this was going to be incredibly important. And all the scaling law papers were effectively out. So if you're surveying the literature or reading up on AI, or you'd see, hey, this curve is coming with scale. And that meant that all these interesting things were going to happen. And so I just started investing behind a lot of the really early companies as they were emerging. So that was Perplexity and Harvey and eventually Decagon and Abridge and OpenAI and all these companies that you mentioned. And maybe a year or two ago, there was so much going on and every model update was a big deal. And there were so many new companies and new competitors that I used to say at the time that AI was the one market where the more I learn, the less I know. Right? Usually, the more you learn about something, the better you know it, the easier you can predict the future, et cetera. But AI was just hazy. There's just too much uncertainty. And I think there's still markets like that in AI. And then I think what's happened over the last year or so is we've really seen sort of convergence of certain companies, certain business models, certain things really working. And so, for example, in the foundation model market, we know there's about a half dozen players. I don't know who the winner is, right? I mean, and it may not be a singular winner. Just like in cloud, we have Azure, we have GCP, and we have AWS. I think for the model layer, we'll similarly have multiple players and multiple winners. But at least we know that the contenders are companies like Google, Anthropic, OpenAI, maybe XAI, maybe Meta, maybe Mistral. It's like a handful. It's not, there's a dozen people.
I think we can agree that the model makers do seem to be sorting themselves out, but are there vertical markets that you
Sure. Yeah, I think code is a good example where it feels like it's consolidated down to the big foundation labs. OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Microsoft, and then I think on the startup side.
You didn't mention Cursor.
Well, I was about to get to it. On the startup side, I think it's Cursor, it's Cognition. Maybe there's outliers like Magic,
Yeah.
So I think we're really seeing this really strong consolidation. For customer support, we know that Decagon and Sierra are important. For health and medical scribing, we know Abridge is important. We know Chimera is important. We know maybe Ambience, maybe some, it's kind of like, we just know who the finalists are, who the contenders are. And I think 2 years ago, it was kind of up in the air. And then separate from that, I think there's other markets where we just don't know. And so financial tooling, there's a bunch of different players. I think there may be one who's finally emerging as a winner, maybe not. Accounting is another area. Different applications of AI to security would be another area. So there's other markets that we know are default very interesting. We just don't know who's going to do it.
And those are still areas that you're exploring, that you're looking for startups. What's the indication that it's going to be the breakout one?
I think that's a really hard question sometimes because in this market, I think there's 2 or 3 things that are under discussed about AI and AI adoption. One is the CEOs of every big company are basically telling their teams, hey, we have an edict, we need to figure out our AI strategy. And so suddenly they're open for business in terms of using new tools in ways they never would before, right? These giant enterprises are willing to try things that 2 years ago they never would have tried, and it's only because of AI. So these markets are remarkably open, which means you can get a lot of customers early.
Right.
And they're big customers, but that doesn't mean they're going to stick.
Right.
And so one of the hard things to see through is traction. Is it real traction? Is it just POCs people are doing because their CEO wants them to do AI? Is it something else? And so it's kind of a little bit of like there's false signal and then there's stuff that's just working. Like Harvey is just working as an example.
So so traction. 2025 did seem like the year that became really evident, right? That all these initial projects or whatever weren't going to stick around. They weren't going to sign up for them for 3-year contracts. So what is the magic number on traction or the magic indicator that it's real traction and not companies that are just going to...
Yeah, I usually just look at things like renewals or recurrence, these other sort of indicators, but fundamentally it's usage, it's renewals. And if a company's 12 months old, they maybe have never had to renew anything, right? But maybe they're expanding a customer for the first time. And then it's just growth rate, like how many customers are adopting it at what rate. And then of course you can call these customers and just ask them like, do you like this? Is it interesting?
Yeah.
All that kind of stuff.
Do you think startups are doing a good job of tracking those kinds of indicators?
Some are and some aren't, and it kind of doesn't matter as long as it's working. So.
All right, so I'm going to claim that the buzzword of 2025 is agents. So there's a lot of startups in this room that are building agents, and they're exciting, they're promising. I mean, there's also like some ludicrous claims being made about agents. There's a startup called Mechanize that wants to replace all white-collar work, all of it, which, go for ambition, but I'm skeptical, to say the least. So what are your thoughts about the state of agents right now?
Yeah, so agents or things like them we've been talking about for a while, and to some extent it's a new form of automation and something that can effectively plan and act on its own relative to a series of commands or prompts that you give it. And we're in the very early days of agentic stuff, and there's certain core components that have been missing historically that are now finally coming into place. And even basic things like some form of memory that the agent goes back to, so it can say, am I updating the task list? People kind of hadn't built that really early on. Like Cognition, for example, talked about this quite early for Devon, which is their coding agent that they launched quite early relative to this agentic wave. But there's still some pieces of infrastructure that are lacking for it to really be there. Obviously, the reasoning models like O3 and things like that have helped a lot, and there's a lot of room to grow there and to develop there. And then I think a lot of it is real, and then some of it, of course, is marketing, right? You tell an enterprise, hey, we have these agentic things, and they're augmenting your workforce, and it sounds like a great story. And again, some of it is true. Like Devon really does some interesting things on its own. Decagon and others are creating these sort of agents for customer support, but I think it's very early days.
Is there an issue with the fact that the foundation models actually lie? And the research shows that they actually tend to lie. Well, like there's hallucinations, that kind of thing.
Sure.
But they actually, sometimes say that they did a task that they actually didn't do.
Yeah.
So how is that going to impact startups building agents on top?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with how well are you correcting for that. And you could argue that foundation models are basically evolving the way that an employee would, right? Or, initially you're hiring like an intern, and they're very eager and they want to help and they're doing all this stuff for you, but they're not always going to get it right, and you have to correct them. And maybe the intern makes stuff up sometimes because they don't know any better, right? And then you wait a year or two and the next set of models come out, and then suddenly you have like a new grad. And then you wait a couple years and suddenly you have like somebody who has 2 years work experience. And so we're running up that curve. And I think every company is basically building in these rails that allow you to make sure that if you have an agent or just an LLM doing something, that it double checks things relative to hallucinations, it double checks things relative to its work. Sometimes when I write prompts, I actually have it, I tell it, here are the 5 things I want you to go back and check. And so I think it's all very navigable, and it reminds me honestly of when I deal with a junior employee and I say, hey, I really want you to, here's your checklist, right? I want you to double check these 3 things. And did you really do X, Y, Z in the spreadsheet or whatever it is? So I think it's very similar to that.
So given the fact that we can both agree that agents are promising, but maybe not quite human replacement right now. So this is, I'm curious what you think about this. So Microsoft laid off 15,000 people this year. Amazon just make news. The numbers are, I'm seeing 14K, I'm seeing 30K. Both these companies are saying it's AI related. And since we know that agents aren't quite human replacement yet, what do you think is going on with these incumbents?
Yeah, so I don't know the specifics of Microsoft or
Fair
Amazon.
enough.
I'd say in general, the way I think about it is a lot of CEOs are right now talking about AI making them dramatically more efficient. And we went through a big hiring phase with ZIRP where people overhired dramatically. And you look at some of these companies and Google went from 110 or 120,000 to over 180,000 people in 2 years, right? They added 60,000 people during the ZIRP period. And so a lot of other companies did that too, and they expanded really dramatically. And now I think some of them are correcting for that. And I think there's some companies are truly applying AI, and that's making the workforce more productive. I think some people are just kind of reflexively saying, AI is making an impact, so we should lay off people, and then we'll provide tooling to make them better. And I think that's just going to happen almost by the fact that people are saying it. It's reflexive, right? And you may not need AI to do these cuts and have them be beneficial, but AI gives you a reason to do them. And so I would guess, again, I don't know Microsoft or Amazon, I would guess in general we're going to see this big wave of AI-driven productivity. And I think a big chunk of it may have nothing to do with AI. And it's just people correcting for, companies overbuilding over time. And then I think a subset of it will be driven by AI and will be important in all the rest of it. But I actually think part of it is just kind of people believing it and therefore doing it and therefore making it self-fulfilling.
So it's AI. It's not really necessary.
Some of it's real, some of it isn't.
They're junior employees, that still requires a lot of handling.
It's back to how much hand-holding do you need and how much training do you need, and also just how productive are people on a relative basis. And you look at some of the companies like what Elon Musk did at Twitter, and that was a very radical reduction in the size of the workforce at Twitter, but then the company started shipping faster. And I think there's a lot of companies where that could happen.
All right, so it feels like the excuse of the day, maybe, instead of
I think it's
accurate.
both. I think it's both. I think for some people it'll be an excuse. I think for some people it'll be real, and there'll be companies that do both too.
All right.
And by the way, excuse may be they really believe it's the reason, right? I actually don't think people are like purposefully lying and saying AI is doing stuff. I think they really believe, AI is going to make us a lot more productive. We can cut staff and add AI. And that's why I'm saying it's reflexive. It is something that through its own self-belief becomes true.
Well, who do you think is getting left behind right now in 2025 because of AI?
I think that one thing that may be a little bit under-discussed is if you look at areas where I think people are going to start cutting early from a headcount perspective, it's actually outsourced firms that you partner with. And so if you look at call centers, you look at a lot of these other, you actually are outsourcing labor to a third party, and it's not your employee base. So you're just cutting a contract. You're not doing a layoff, right? And I think that's where we're going to see, or where I think some of these reductions are already happening, and they're less visible or less evident because, again, you're terminating a contract, you're not letting go of people.
All right, that's interesting. So we all see how much money, VC money, is chasing AI. So walk me through a deal like this. In February, Harvey raises $300 million at a $3 billion valuation. 4 months later, it raises another $300 million at a $5 billion valuation. Mm-hmm. So it couldn't have needed the money, in a couple of months. So walk me through that. Why is that a good idea? What risk is there in doing these round after round?
Sure.
It feels very 2021.
Yeah. So I can't say anything about Harvey specifically, but I think in general, that, to some extent, the best companies used to raise every, say, 9 to 18 months, right? And that was largely driven by when do you have a big enough step up in progress that the company should then have the next step up in valuation. And people would often raise at the next valuation for all sorts of reasons, including hiring packages, the ability to do M&A, maybe for press, maybe because they need the cash to fuel growth because they're growing faster than they think. So I think there's all sorts of applications of the capital. And I actually often tell people, hey, don't raise money. Just keep going. Wait another 6 months, and if your valuation goes up another 50, 100%, you dilute less, right? So I think I'm one of the few people who is incentivized to say take more money, but I usually say, actually, is this the right thing to do? And I think what's happening with AI is companies are growing so fast because the markets are open in this way that we discussed before. CEOs are willing to try things. Companies are willing to adopt things. Usually it's a long slog to convince somebody to take your startup's product and use it. But we've gone through a transition because of AI where suddenly people are willing to try stuff like they never were before. It's wide open markets. And so you're seeing these growth rates that are just insane, right? And so if you're growing that fast, remarketing the company sooner is what happens because you've shown so much more progress in 6 months.
3 months, though? 3 months?
Well, I don't know the specifics of this. Sometimes there's a lag between a round is raised and announced. There's other factors, but it could also be, hey, somebody came in with a good offer 3 months later, great. So I think it's very case by case in terms of what's happening. I do think that we underappreciate the degree to which rounds are sometimes done, and then they get announced 6-9 months later for all sorts of companies. And then they do a follow-on round 3 months later, but really a year has passed. And so I think, I'm not saying Harvey, I'm just saying that also happens sometimes in venture.
Okay. So, but what if it is, the what if it's a bubble thing? But like we did just see this whole thing happen in 2021, right?
Sure.
So what's the damage if it is a bubble and these companies are over raising and are just doing the
Sure.
they're taking the money now because it's there,
Yeah.
and they're growing their valuations because it's now.
Sure.
What's the risk?
I was looking at the data from the 90s because I was trying to look at the internet bubble and learn from that. And do you know how many companies went public in 99?
I do not.
Okay, about
Do you?
450.
450.
And then in the first few months of 2020, another 450 went public. And say that 1,000 or so companies went public in the 2 years before that, or few years before that. So roughly say 2,000 companies went public-ish. How many of those are still relevant today? How many survived, right? It's a small handful.
Right.
There's 2 or 3 companies that are outsized.
Right.
There's maybe a dozen or 2 that are important. And then everything else died, got bought, went bankrupt, whatever it is, ran out of cash after raising in the public markets. There's no reason to think that AI is going to be different. There's going to be a handful of companies that are going to be incredibly important. And there are also going to be resets over time, right? I mean, Amazon, when it went public, was worth, I don't remember what it was, a few $100 million, 600 to 800. And then it ran way up, and then it dropped way down. And then I think it is low in 2000-ish, 2001, 2002. It's probably like a $2 billion company, $3 billion. I don't know what it was. It was quite small, right, on a relative basis. That should happen in AI for a subset of companies. And then the other thing that's going to happen, so we think, there'll be a dozen companies, 2 dozen that are going to be really important. Everybody thinks that's the company they started or the company they invested in. And of course, 99% of people are going to be wrong. And then there's a good question of when should you exit, right? So you're a founder and your thing may or may not work. Should you sell or not, right? Or you're an investor, how should you think about that? And so I think there's these other dynamics that will happen over the next 5 to 10 years as we go through this cycle. But the flip side of it is there's going to be these massive franchises, just like Amazon came out of that era, eBay came out of that era, PayPal came out of that era, Google came a little bit later, but effectively came out of that era. Amazing companies actually happened. And so the question is, who's the Google and who's the pets.com? Right?
Well, I'm sure most of the people in this room think or hope it's them. But, that's a little depressing to think about. Well, there's only going to be a handful. So are you advising people to just think about all the different off-ramps, all the different exit options that they might have for whatever they're building now?
I think people should always think about that. And I think the hard part is often when you're running a board and you bring up, hey, should we sell now or not? The board misinterprets it as a lack of enthusiasm, a lack of conviction, a lack of drive. And often it's more just being rational and saying, let's check in. And so one thing that I've seen people do from a board hygiene perspective is they basically say, let's talk once a year as a board about whether now's the right time to sell. And we should do it non-emotionally. We pre-schedule it. We know it's not because anybody wants to sell or not sell. It's because we want to have that conversation. Because in markets, there are moments in time that are the optimal valuation for you to exit. For the best companies, that's roughly never, right? There's some companies that never should have sold.
Yeah.
But for most companies, there is a moment in time when it's the right time to get out. And that's for the founders, right? Because ultimately, A, it's life-changing financially. B, your thing may not end up working. And getting out while something's working helps you then, continue your career, make sure your employees land well, everything can kind of work out in a positive way.
So it's sort of worth mapping out what your off-ramps might be in different scenarios as you're building.
Yeah, and it's hard to tell sometimes, but sometimes a company will start talking to you about buying you, is that the right time or not? Should you wait a year? Should you just keep going? How much do you know? And I think it becomes too emotional of a conversation often, and I think it should just be made very rational and just let's talk every year and see.
All right, so I want to ask you, I'm dying to ask you about this one. So you've had a really wide-ranging career. He's nervous already. So you had a PhD, right, from MIT in biology, longevity, right?
It was, I worked on a genetic pathway that was an intersection of longevity and aging, cancer, and insulin.
So sort of, yes. Anyway, I want to ask you, how...
That was a very PhD biology answer. I'm actually.
I want to know, give us a few tips on living longer.
Oh, geez.
What's the secret?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I think.
How long do you want to live?
Well, it's really interesting if you think about it, because if you look at different organisms, there's gene knockouts that let, for example, these little worms called C. elegans live 2 to 3 times longer. So they'll be healthy adults for 2 to 3 times longer, and then they'll crash out. And this is a single gene knockout. And usually if you can knock out a gene and it has a function, you can drug it, right? You can have a drug do the same effect. It'll stop an enzyme from working or things like that. So we know across every organism that there are genes that impact longevity that we've studied. And so we know we can modulate it. And so I think it's a really interesting question to ask. Say people could live 200 years or 300 years or whatever the number is. How does that impact how you think about how you live your life? Do you have multiple families over time that you restart every 100 years? How do you think about your career? When do you study versus travel versus work? How do you think about saving money to last you 300 years, right? There's all these very fundamental different questions. There's other questions. The Supreme Court, it's a lifetime appointment. Imagine if we had judges from the 1800s in power right now.
I think you're terrifying a few people in this room right
no,
now.
but these are real implications. And if you think about it, longevity allows you to aggregate power in different ways that may be very detrimental. Imagine if Stalin was still alive. Imagine, like there's these other scenarios.
Okay, short of 300 years.
Yeah.
Did your research show any?
Yeah, there's a bunch of drugs that have small effects. Rapamycin, metformin is very minor, but rapamycin seems to work, although it's an immune suppressant. So, I wouldn't recommend going out and taking that, as a random thing to do. But there's also drugs in the pipeline that are often created for other areas in pharma that seem to have longevity effects.
So treating aging as an illness almost.
Yeah, I think aging is a root cause of a lot of illnesses.
Yeah.
Right? The reason you get certain types of cancer within a certain age range, or the reason you always have heart attacks unless it's hereditary within a certain age range, that's systems basically breaking down with aging.
Have you invested in any longevity startups?
Yeah, I invested in a company called BioAge, which is now a public company. And so I led their very first round and was involved quite early. And so that's an example of a company that very publicly has disclosed different drugs that it's working on relative to this area, some of them in muscle wasting and metabolism.
Do you think we're going to cure aging-related illnesses, I don't know, next 50 years? I mean, I'm in a hurry.
No, I want to yesterday. I think we could do it. The question is there the capital and will to do so? Because the way the pharma industry is structured, there's a small focus on a very small number of drug areas, cancer, cardio, neurology, et cetera. And aging isn't really considered one of these categories traditionally. If you look at the National Institutes of Aging, almost all of its money just goes to Alzheimer's, which isn't aging. It's a disease of when you get older.
Right.
And so we actually spend very little money societally, not only on aging, but more generally on prevention. I think it's something like 90% of all of our healthcare spend goes to chronic versus preventative medicine. And there's all sorts of incentives in terms of why we do that.
We have to switch the way we think about
yeah, exactly.
All right.
But I think the takeaways would be sleep well, exercise, eat right. Clean. Yeah, it's
there's nothing in there about partying, having a good time.
That's part of it too. You're happier at least, So.
Dang. Okay, so you're solo GP of is it 3 billion or 4 billion?
We haven't announced anything specific. Yeah.
Okay, under management, 3 billion or 4 billion, but we don't know. So I want to know, as the boss of your world, who do you go to for advice?
There's a lot of people I go to for advice. I tend to ask people that I think know an area really well about the area. So if I'm looking at a vertical AI company, I call a different set of people than if I'm looking at something in crypto. Then if it's kind of, I try to tailor it to who do I think are the most insightful people in a given area and ask them for advice on different things. And then separate from that, there's obviously customer calls or other things you can do to try and understand if a market is good or a product's good to build or things like that.
Are there people you would never go to for? You have a podcast. You've had over 100 guests on. Are there categories of people you would never go to for advice?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. Undoubtedly, there's people who have often steered me wrong. So I probably wouldn't go back for more of that. So
what's the best advice you've ever had?
It's an excellent question. I have to think on that. I don't want to say something off the cuff. That's just kind of, that's a great question.
I did want to ask you one final question, though. This is nothing to do with longevity or advice or career. It's just the Trump administration lately is buying companies. The Intel's the biggest one, but there was some talk about them possibly getting into quantum. They've been denied, whatever. So I'm just curious, is that something that you think is a good idea? It feels a little like state-owned companies to me, but as an investor, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, the honest truth is I haven't looked into it at all. So it's not something that touches the types of companies I'm involved with. I tend to really focus on early to sort of middle stage private companies. Intel is now a, what would it be, 50-year-old company plus. And that's just not my world. And so my focus is very singular. People often ask me, for example, how much do I invest around the world? And do you invest in Latin America? And do you invest in Africa? Do you invest in Europe? And I do very, very, very little outside of the Bay Area. And so I'm very provincial in my mindset. It's kind of like, what are the most important technology startups that I know about? Most of them are here. Some increasingly are in New York. There's a smattering in Europe. I don't do anything in China. So that's kind of my focus.
So that might be another key to longevity is just don't stress the stuff that's not in your
There's nothing I can do about it.
Nothing I can do about it.
Yeah.
They're going to buy. Okay, so besides AI, are there other areas that are hot right now?
There's definitely hot areas. Obviously, it feels like there's a there's a lot of activity around defense, around American resilience, around repatriation of manufacturing. So some people are calling it like American durability or American exceptional, so there's that kind of wave that's happening. And obviously, globally, there's a defense tech wave. I think the invasion of Ukraine by Russia woke a lot of people up to the fact that defense matters still. And then obviously what's happened in Israel similarly has woken up a lot of people to wars still happen.
So what are the opportunities in defense tech?
I think there's a number. I mean, the reality is we're doing this massive shift towards autonomous systems and computer-driven systems and machine vision and all these things which Anduril and others have pioneered quite early. And so we've made investments in, I think, 4-ish defense companies, and then companies that do other things that overlap with defense sometimes. Like Applied Intuition is mainly automotive platforms and other things, but they do some defense stuff. Scale obviously was doing data labeling for everyone, including the US government. So those aren't really defense contractors. But we've invested in Anduril, Saronic, Helsing in Europe, Kayla in Israel. And I think that's the set. I could be misremembering. Maybe there's another one.
Any other areas?
And that, I should say that's over the last 10, 15 years.
10, 15 years. Any other areas you're thinking are under the radar and you'd like to see more startups?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, it's interesting. There's almost two ways to think about the world. There's like the consensus right now, which is AI. And I think it's correct, right? Consensus doesn't mean wrong. I think it's like a huge 10-year, 20-year wave that we'll continue to focus on. Defense tech, we got to quite early with Anduril, which I think I initially invested in 2016 or 17, whenever the first round happened, and then eventually led their Series D and sort of kept going with the company. And so I feel like there's things that are just waves that started a while ago that are continuing, and then there's areas that seem really interesting, but I don't know the best way to participate in them. Energy would be one. So we're investors in base power, in Charm in terms of really trying to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Like there's 2 or 3 aspects of energy that I think are kind of interesting over time. But in general, if you assume that energy is an input into everything and we're going to be very energy consumptive in the future, then we need to build more forms of energy. And so I think that's an interesting area. We'll see what that means. And then there's things that I wish would happen that are just slower. Healthcare, education, the big societal problems, but I haven't done a lot of investing there, in part because I just think those are really hard markets for private companies to do well in.
What's Monumental?
Oh yeah, so we're doing this project called Monumental where we're, if you look at multiple societies around the globe, the Mayans building their temples, the pyramids in Egypt, the ruins from Rome and, or Greco-Roman culture, there's a lot of examples of very large, awe-inspiring, either architectural work, statues, et cetera. You go back to the 7 wonders of the ancient world, right?
You're going to build you're going to build an 8th wonder, is that what
our hope is to basically start building large-scale public art at a scale that hasn't been seen in a while.
Really?
Yeah.
That's what Monumental is?
Yeah, that's what it is. And so it's been really fun. We've put in a bid to do something in Palisades, given that there was the fires there, and we thought it'd be really nice to build something to help commemorate and inspire people there. And then we've been looking at different sites around 4 or 5 cities around the country with the hope that eventually, we start off, have you seen that atlas in front of Rockefeller Center in New York? That's about a 15, 20-foot work. It's still very striking, right?
Yeah.
But we want to start off with doing works of that size and then eventually get to something the size of like the Statue of Liberty or, the Eiffel Tower. And the last time we built something like that in the US at true scale like that, that's sort of nationally recognized was probably Mount Rushmore, and that initiated in the 20s and ended in the 40s. So we've had about 80 years where we haven't really done anything that...
It's time.
It's time. So
is this a for-profit?
No, it's just a nonprofit-y thing.
It's a nonprofit.
Yeah, I was just trying to do something useful.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. So, well, we are almost out of
Okay,
time.
sure.
Well, I'm going to have to capture you for a podcast and
Yeah,
ask
no,
you
I
the
really
rest of
appreciate
these
the
questions.
time today. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for including me. Thanks everybody for making it.
Yeah.